مساء الخير وأهلا بكم إلى هذه الحلقة الجديدة من واشنطن أونلاين. معي أنا هدي العويس على نورث بريس. إصرار كبير من الحكومة التركية على ربط تفجير تقسيم الأخير بقوات سوريا الديمقراطية والحملة الدولية لمكافحة تنظيم داعش ومدينة كوباني بما لها من رمزية كبيرة في مقاومة تنظيم داعش المتطرف. وزارة الداخلية التركية تقول أنها لن تقبل تعازي الولايات المتحدة بضحايا تفجير تقسيم، لأن تركيا تعتبر الولايات المتحدة داعم ومغذي للإرهاب في الشمال السوري. فما الذي تريده تركيا من هذه الاتهامات لقوات سوريا الديمقراطية وأهالي مدينة كوباني؟ ولماذا تربط الحملة الدولية لمكافحة تنظيم داعش والشراكة ما بين الولايات المتحدة وقسد بالتفجير الأخير؟ هذا ما نبحثه في حلقة اليوم من واشنطن أونلاين. وضيوفي لهذه الحلقة هما السيد كالفين وايلدر، الباحث في الشؤون التركية في معهد نيو لاينز الأمريكي، ينضم إلينا من واشنطن عبر سكايب. أهلا وسهلا بك سيد كالفين. سيد كالفين، بالإضافة إلى التهديدات التركية الأخيرة لقوات سوريا الديمقراطية والاتهامات الموجهة لها بعد تفجير تقسيم، وقبل ذلك أيضا هناك هجمات لا تتوقف بالمسيرات التركية تستهدف قيادات في شمال شرق سوريا، قيادات قاتلت جنبا إلى جنب مع الولايات المتحدة. كيف تنظر أمريكا إلى حالة الخطر الدائمة التي تحيط بهذه المنطقة التي كانت تكافح وتقاتل لمحاربة تنظيم داعش الإرهابي المتطرف بشراكة مع الولايات المتحدة؟
Yeah, absolutely. So since late spring or early summer, Turkey's position has been that they would like to launch a new major offensive in northeast Syria to, degrade the SDF and take more territory from them. And Washington has been very firmly opposed to that and has been very clear with Turkey that they don't want to see a new ground offensive by Turkey or its proxies. So from their perspective, the drone strikes are not ideal. They're obviously degrading a key U.S. ally in the fight against ISIS in northeast Syria, but they're certainly preferable to a major new offensive. And so I think that there's probably a reluctance in Washington to make a huge deal out of this. Certainly, I think that there's a desire to see this drone campaign end, and there's probably some private conversations happening behind the scenes, but definitely a limited willingness to apply major pressure on Turkey over this.
سيد كالفين، هل تقيد الحرب في أوكرانيا اليوم الولايات المتحدة وتمنعها من الرد على هذه التهديدات التركية للشمال السوري كما فعلت حكومات أخرى غربية؟ السويد سمعنا منها مؤخرا بأنها ستقطع علاقتها بجماعات كردية لكي تنال الرضا التركي على مسألة انضمام السويد وفنلندا لقوات الناتو.
Yeah, so on a practical level, the U.S. security assistance to the SDF is very small, and the type of equipment that we're giving the SDF is not the same as what we're giving to Ukraine. So there's not really going to be a situation, I don't think, where the U.S. is so committed to the fight in Ukraine and so committed to giving military assistance there that there's nothing left over for the SDF. The total size of the budget there is $200 million a year for the SDF, and I think we've given probably at least 5 times that to Ukraine already. So it's a fairly modest security assistance package. So I don't really see it as being like the Ukraine war making it impossible to continue that relationship. I think it's definitely fair to say that the focus right now is on Ukraine, and so that the bandwidth on the diplomatic side to be putting pressure to de-escalate in Syria, or to be thinking of creative solutions, or thinking about potentially, surging resources into Syria, that's certainly out of the question at this point. But I think that was already something that was limited before the Ukraine crisis even happened. I think that certainly Russia's bandwidth in Syria has gotten much more limited, and Russia certainly seen a need for them to commit more resources, obviously, to Ukraine, which has caused them to have to pull troops out of Syria and pull certain weapon systems out of Syria, and potentially left them a little bit more vulnerable. So if you're thinking about how the Ukraine war has affected the situation in Syria, I would say that that's probably the more tangible effects that you've seen.
نعم، بالتزامن مع هذه التهديدات التركية لقوات سوريا الديمقراطية والانشغال الأمريكي في حرب أوكرانيا، هناك خطوات تركية وإن كانت بطيئة باتجاه التطبيع مع دمشق. ما مدى جدية خطوات التطبيع هذه؟ وهل ستقف الولايات المتحدة عند نقطة معينة يتطور فيها هذا التطبيع لتمنع أنقرة من التطبيع مع دمشق، بما أن أمريكا تصر على وجود وجود عملية انتقال سياسي يجب أن تحدث في سوريا لكي تقول الولايات المتحدة ويقول المجتمع الدولي أن الحرب فعلا انتهت في سوريا.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to be precise with what we talk about when we talk about normalization. I think Turkey certainly has come around to the idea that Assad is in Damascus to stay and that regime change is no longer a feasible outcome. And so what that means is that there's a desire to create some sort of working relationship with the Assad regime. And so you've seen over the course of the past year sort of a quiet intensification of security cooperation. What exactly that looks like isn't totally clear, but certainly there's some level of intelligence sharing between the two sides. And obviously the big thing that happened in August was a shift in sort of Turkish public policy towards potentially upgrading diplomatic relations. But what that doesn't mean is that there's any clear roadmap for a Turkish withdrawal. So Turkey's obviously occupying Turkey or Turkish proxies are occupying a significant portion of northern Syria right now. From Assad's perspective, they obviously need to go home. Assad's perspective is that he wants complete control over the country. Turkey's perspective is that they don't have any way to do that without instigating a major new round of fighting and a new refugee flow into Turkey. So ending that occupation is kind of a non-starter. So how you get from where we are now to a real full normalization in which the Turkish military withdraws from Syria is, I think, very unclear. I think that what you have right now is a roadmap for a more uneasy working relationship going forward in which Turkey's not calling for regime change and they're trying to figure out a way to live with the Assad regime, but still a lot of tension in that relationship for sure.
نعم كالفن، حضرتك كتبت عن نهاية عهد قبول اللاجئين السوريين في الدول المجاورة لسوريا والدول البعيدة عن سوريا كذلك. هل نشهد فعلا حملات لإعادة اللاجئين إلى الأراضي السورية؟ نسمع عن حملات لإعادة اللاجئين من لبنان، من أربيل، من تركيا. هل تسمح القوانين الدولية فعلا بإعادة اللاجئين بشكل إجباري إلى الأراضي السورية؟
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we already absolutely are at a point where we're seeing a lot of pressure being put on Turkish or on Syrian refugees to return back to Syria. Certainly in Turkey and also in Lebanon, I would say are the two major places to watch there, but all across the region where you have Syrian refugees. I think that Syrian refugees themselves are very, very clear. There's lots of polling data on this, especially in Turkey. They do not want to go home. They don't feel like they can go home safely. They feel like they'll be targeted by the regime. And on top of that, there's not necessarily anything for them to go home to because their homes have been taken over and looted and stripped for parts. So I think that Syrian refugees have been very emphatic that they would like to stay where they are. And certainly from a perspective of international law, it's a human rights violation to forcibly return refugees. So I don't think that there's any ambiguity there over whether or not forcible return is a human rights violation. Certainly from Turkey's perspective, and I think from Lebanon's perspective, and maybe to a lesser extent, Jordan and Iraq, they feel like they took in these refugees as a sort of as a limited thing, and that these refugees would go home once the war ended. And they feel now like this has turned into an open-ended commitment to host these refugees with no clear end in sight to the war. And so they're looking for alternatives. And one of those alternatives definitely is to pressure these refugees to return whether they want to or not. And I think that there's definitely space for other international actors to come in and try to limit that and potentially work with these countries to try to create more durable solutions to the refugee crisis.
نعم كالفن، أعود معك إلى تصريحات الحكومة السويدية بعد أن وصلت حكومة يمينية إلى الحكم في السويد في الانتخابات الأخيرة. هناك تصريحات من وزيرة الخارجية السويدية بأن السويد ستقطع علاقتها مع الجماعات الكردية، وهنا كان المقصود وحدة حماية الشعب وأيضا قوات سوريا الديمقراطية. ما الذي يعنيه مثل هذا القرار السويدي لنيل الرضا التركي لعضوية السويد في حلف الناتو على أرض الواقع؟ كيف يؤثر على قوات سوريا الديمقراطية؟
Yeah, so what exactly this will mean in practical terms, I don't think is totally clear yet. Certainly you had the previous government in Sweden that took a pretty hard line on this stuff and said that they weren't going to cave to what Erdogan wanted. And the new government has indicated a little bit more of an openness towards distancing itself from the SDF. I think in practical terms in Northeast Syria, the effects are likely to be very small because Swedish military assistance was never sort of the dominant thing that was supporting the SDF. So even if they were to shift away from that, I don't think you'd see any real major implications for Northeast Syria. But definitely Erdogan is laying down the line saying that he doesn't want friendly Western relations with the YPG or with YPG affiliated groups, and that this sort of NATO accession process has given him leverage to try to force that issue. But again, at this point, the statements that the Swedish government have made, I think, have been pretty vague. They've indicated a willingness to distance themselves. Whether that will mean outlawing certain groups is not really clear. And I think that right now they've still been pretty clear that they're not going to be repatriating Turkish citizens, which was one of the key demands originally from Erdogan, was to have people that were perceived as being close to either the PKK or the Golanist movement to be repatriated to Turkey. And I think that right now there's still no real willingness on the part of Sweden or any other country to accede to those requests.
وأخيرا كالفن، مع انقسام الكونغرس الأمريكي اليوم بين مجلس شيوخ يسيطر عليه الحزب الديمقراطي ومجلس نواب يسيطر عليه الحزب الجمهوري، هل نتوقع تغير في السياسات الأمريكية تجاه التهديدات التركية لشمال شرق سوريا؟ هل سنرى مواقف مختلفة إذا ما أقدمت تركيا على اعتداءات جديدة ضد الشمال السوري، أم أن الوضع يبقى على ما هو عليه بوجود إدارة جو بايدن في البيت الأبيض لسنتين قادمتين؟
Yeah, so I don't think that any major shift in Syria policy is likely, regardless of what happens today at the polls in terms of who ends up controlling Congress. I think that support for the SDF is relatively nonpartisan, notwithstanding Trump obviously made some decisions to pull support there, but it's not clear to me that he had any sort of broader base of support in the Republican Party for doing that. So if you see other Republicans coming into Congress, I'm not sure that you'll see a lot of pressure to reduce the level of support there or to rethink the U.S. relationship with Turkey. I haven't seen any sort of statements by Republican or Democratic officials indicating a huge difference in how they want to approach this issue set right now. I think the bottom line is that the bandwidth to focus on Syria from the perspective of Congress is pretty limited. So I just don't think there'll be a lot of energy to shift that policy, regardless of who controls Congress.
نعم، شكرا جزيلا لك ضيفي كالفين وايلدر، كنت معنا من واشنطن عبر سكايب.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure talking to you.
وفي الختام شكرا لكل من تابع واشنطن أونلاين، ألقاكم في حلقة جديدة الأسبوع المقبل، إلى اللقاء.